It's the summer of 2013, and the Milwaukee Bucks are in a bit of a pickle. The Bucks find themselves trying to regroup and restructure their roster around both Monta Ellis and Brandon Jennings. However, it became pretty clear rather quickly that the duo had a very obvious ceiling. A 38-win first-round exit ceiling at that, which isn't something that is all that impressive. To make matters worse, Monta Ellis has the ability to opt out of his contract. The NBA is pushing ownership to invest more money into the organization so they can update the arena, which is something that is easier said than done, especially when you consider that Milwaukee is one of the smaller markets in the NBA, and a rebuild at this point is basically inevitable. The very next season, the Milwaukee Bucks found themselves with not only the worst record in the NBA, but one of the worst records in league history, and yet somehow, some way, in just a 5-year span, the Milwaukee Bucks not only find themselves at the top of the league with the best record in the NBA, but also having the potential to have one of the best records in franchise history. So, how exactly were they able to do this? It's the summer of 2013, and the Milwaukee Bucks are basically looking at a rebuild. They have exhausted all their options with both Michael Redd and Andrew Bogut, which neither one of them really panned out due to injuries. And after trading Bogut to the Golden State Warriors, they found themselves desperately trying to build a team around Brandon Jennings and Monta Ellis. A very, very desperate act, since neither one of them are impactful enough to lead this team to any massive amount of success, and that's exactly what happened at the end of the 2013 season. The Bucks finished the season with a losing record of 38-44. However, that was good enough to actually make the playoffs, which is a very sick reality because when you are a team that more or less needs to rebuild, making the playoffs really and truly doesn't help you out whatsoever. And oh yes, let me not forget, Monta Ellis, who at the time was the best player on the team, has the opportunity to opt out of his contract, which eventually he does and goes on to sign with the Dallas Mavericks. So yeah, rebuild. And again, since they made the playoffs, they were outside the lottery, giving them a 15th overall pick in a draft class that many people viewed was questionable at best. However, unbeknownst to a lot of people, the Milwaukee Bucks end up receiving possibly the biggest steal in the last 20 to 30 years with Giannis Antetokounmpo. Giannis at the time was a raw prospect, to put it lightly. And even though the potential was clearly there, a lot of organizations skipped over Giannis, not just because there were possibly better players ahead of him, but also they viewed him as a project, and even his ceiling was at best, and I quote, Nicholas Batum. And then from there, the Milwaukee Bucks thoroughly committed to the rebuild, hit the restart button, and practically traded away all of their most valuable assets. Unfortunately, a lot of the players though on the roster just weren't that good. They traded JJ Redick to the Clippers, which was part of a 3-team trade, and in return basically received some second rounders. The Bucks also traded away this guy, and in return he too brought in some more second round picks. And then they traded Luc Mbah a Moute to the Sacramento Kings, and in return, you guessed it, another second rounder. The only true valuable asset that the Milwaukee Bucks had to offer was Brandon Jennings. However, Jennings was actually a restricted free agent this offseason, as his contract had expired from his rookie deal, and the Bucks were somewhat hesitant to bring him back. See, Brandon Jennings was still young enough to participate in the rebuild. However, his financial demands to be compensated very similar to some of his peers in the 2009 draft class came across as a bit much, even for a lot of other organizations as well. So Brandon Jennings, for a majority of the free agency frenzy, that is the month of July, stayed a free agent until the end of the month when the Detroit Pistons decided to take a swing at him. In return, the Bucks received this guy, but at the time, most notably, you had Brandon Knight. And to the Bucks' credit, Brandon Knight, in my opinion, turned out to be a better player than Brandon Jennings, but as we all are aware, the most valuable player in this transaction turned out to be Chris Middleton, who would eventually become an all-star, consistent 15 to 20 point scorer, and a great secondary option for the organization just a few years down the line. The Milwaukee Bucks would also finish the 2013 offseason by signing players such as OJ Mayo, Gary Neal, Zaza Pachulia, and bringing in a new head coach in Larry Drew, but nothing of significance that would allude to this team having a massive successful season in the upcoming year. And since the roster was composed of basically a whole bunch of young players and journeymen, the outcome should have been expected, but I don't think a lot of people thought the Bucks were going to be this bad. By the end of the 2014 season, the Bucks had a record of only 15-67. Not only making that the worst record in franchise history, but literally the 2013-2014 Milwaukee Bucks one of the worst teams in NBA history. But hope is on the way. See, the Bucks, they were bad, but they were bad at the right time, as they positioned themselves to get a high draft pick in what many people would argue was one of the most talented draft classes the NBA had seen since 2003, and had the potential to be one of the most talented draft classes in league's history. And one of the standout players amongst the group of young players was Jabari Parker, who was selected by the Milwaukee Bucks with the 2nd overall pick. Jabari Parker quickly gained attention of the mainstream media, especially with his play in Duke, and immediately started to draw some comparisons to players such as Paul Pierce and Carmelo Anthony. Parker was actually viewed so highly that many people argue that he was the most NBA-ready prospect in the draft. And oh yeah, the Milwaukee Bucks somewhere in the middle of the offseason decided to trade for Jason Kidd, who at the time was a head coach, but didn't necessarily inform Larry Drew that he was going to lose his job. So they just gave Jason Kidd the position and just hoped that Larry Drew was able to put the pieces together. So now with Jabari Parker on the roster and Jason Kidd as the head coach, and with the prior season being a 15-win year, expectations obviously increase, and the organization entered the next season very optimistic. But unfortunately, things just took a massive turn for the worse. On December 15th, Jabari suffered a season-ending injury, tearing his ACL against the Phoenix Suns, basically derailing the entire season since the organization really didn't have that much faith in any of the other younger players. Or at least that's what people thought initially. See, after Jabari Parker suffered his injury, the Milwaukee Bucks were able to stay afloat for a majority of the season, and with some of the younger players finally showing growth and development, John Hammond decided to take advantage of the opportunity and get an upgrade at the point guard position, or at least that's what he thought he was getting. As Milwaukee Bucks participated in a 3-team trade, sending Brandon Knight to the Phoenix Suns, and in return receiving some other young players and assets, but the most noteworthy one was Michael Carter-Williams. Now, granted, at the time, Michael Carter-Williams was viewed as somewhat of a valuable commodity, but to make a long story short, it really didn't work out for Milwaukee whatsoever. The Bucks went from a team that was projected to win around 45 to potentially 50 games to a team that finished with a 500 record, giving them a very unfavorable seeding in the playoffs and thus getting knocked out in the first round. However, there was a lot of positives to take away from the season. Giannis and Middleton really started to progress and they showed a lot of growth. This was a young team that had the ability to push for a playoff spot, and they were able to get some postseason success, and they did all of this without Jabari Parker. So naturally, the level of optimism and expectations that we saw in the beginning of the year carried over to the next season. But unfortunately, the young team took a step back by the end of the 2015-2016 season, ending the year with only 33 wins. But there was one silver lining, and that was Giannis's development. This is the year in which Giannis famously started to play some heavy minutes at the point guard position. Giannis in the last 30 games of the season averaged 18.5 points, 8 rebounds, nearly 7 assists, 2 blocks, while shooting 50% from the field. And also when it comes to Chris Middleton, he too exploded on the scene. In his last 30 games of this season, he was a 19-point scorer while shooting 36% from behind the arc, 88% from the free throw line, while averaging 2.5 steals per game. And on the bright side, since they didn't make the playoffs that year, they actually had a lottery pick, and it was the 10th overall. And with the 10th overall selection, they decided to go with Thon Maker. However, as many of us are aware now, Thon Maker never really turned out to be the player that we all expected, or at least some of us expected. But the one player that the Bucks selected during his draft class who turned out to be a major acquisition for this roster was Malcolm Brogdon. Now remember about 2 off seasons ago when I said that they traded Luke Baamute for a 2nd round pick? Yeah, that 2nd round pick turned out to be Malcolm Brogdon. And then within the next month, they decided to also just trade Michael Carter-Williams to the Chicago Bulls and in return receive Tony Snell, as it was very obvious that A, they needed a little bit more depth on the perimeter, especially floor spacing, which Michael Carter-Williams wasn't going to be able to provide, and B, Michael Carter-Williams just wasn't that good at all. And so with the development of Giannis and Chris Middleton continuously being shown, and potentially with Jabari Parker coming back for a fully healthy season, the offseason for the Milwaukee Bucks was somewhat optimistic for a team that finished well below expectations. But, that didn't really last long, unfortunately, because tragedy just has to strike yet again. Before the season could even begin, Chris Middleton was sidelined with a hamstring injury for the next 6 months. Fast forward to February 8th, where Chris Middleton was participating in his season debut, and I kid you not, and this is no joke, and it's easily one of the most unluckiest things I've seen amongst NBA teams in a very long time. Jabari Parker goes down with another ACL injury, out for the remainder of the season, and quite frankly, it wasn't clear on what type of player he was going to be moving forward. The Milwaukee Bucks 2016-2017 season was basically over with. They finished the year with a record of 42-40, and they were bounced out in the first round yet again. And I know there's always some positives that you can take away from the year. However, reality was really starting to settle in with the organization, and certain questions needed to be answered. And normally, the GM has those answers, but unfortunately in the summer of 2017, General Manager John Hammond decided to depart from the organization, take his talents to Orlando, and become the GM for the Magic. To replace him, John Horst was promoted to GM, and he had a lot on his plate entering the 2017-2018 season. Jabari Parker was on his last year of his contract. However, everyone in the organization was very hesitant on giving him an extension, largely due to his obvious injury problems. Then you potentially had a head coaching problem where Jason Kidd just really wasn't panning out, especially his lack of imagination, if I could put it lightly, on the offensive end. And then you also had to take into consideration that the roster was still incomplete, especially at the point guard position. So John Horst went into action. First things first was bringing in a starting caliber point guard. Eric Bledsoe conveniently was displeased with the Phoenix Suns, so acquiring him was rather simple. The second thing was a head coach. The Bucks gave Jason Kidd another 30 to 40 games before firing him in the middle of the season, as the Milwaukee Bucks were still relatively a 500 ball club. The Bucks finished the 2018 season with a record of 44-38, good enough to make the playoffs, but not good enough to avoid getting knocked out in the first round again. But the Bucks were not done yet. They hired head coach Mike Budenholzer, committed to a style of play that was going to surround Giannis with shooters, and they decided to finally make a decision on Jabari Parker and let him walk and sign with the Chicago Bulls. So heading into the 2018-2019 season, the Bucks had an identity, a new head coach, and Giannis was really starting to peak as one of the better players in the NBA. Chris Middleton continued to grow as well, and they built themselves a very quality roster. However, many people still had questions, which is a huge reason why before this year even began, most people were projecting them to be the 4th or possibly 5th seed in the Eastern Conference. However, the Milwaukee Bucks have been one of the biggest surprises so far this season, and I'm happy to say that this team could compete for a championship this year. But the bigger picture and why I actually wanted to make this video is because after the Bucks traded Thonmaker and in return received Nikola Mirotic, that meant that the 2 lottery picks that they had within this last 5 years of their rebuild, they no longer possess. However, they still have found a way to become an elite level team, proving yet again that you don't have to just sit around, tank, and pray and hope that the player that you draft will miraculously change your whole franchise. And actually, it takes way more than just tanking in hopes that your team will someday lift up the championship trophy. It takes time, patience, some luck, but more importantly, the right decisions, which is something that the Milwaukee Bucks have consistently done within the last 5 years. And with all that being said, people, please let me know what you think about the video in the comment section below. No, I have not forgotten about my tanking video. It's just taking me longer to actually make that video because all of the information I need to gather. Also, I've been told multiple times to promote the Discord. So if you are on Discord, you can go and click the link in the description, and I might actually have it pinned in the comment section. But until next time, I'll see you all later. Peace.